Picture a courtroom where the fate of empires hangs in the balance, not because of war or treaties, but because of a single question: should this marriage end? In the Middle Ages, divorce trials were never just about broken hearts. They were explosive showdowns where love took a backseat to power, where the personal became dangerously political. Behind every crumbling marriage lay a web of alliances, inheritances, and thrones at stake. This was an era when a single annulment could topple kings, redraw borders, or ignite wars that lasted generations. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on these medieval dramas to reveal how divorce courts became battlegrounds for control over entire kingdoms. Think about the last time you heard a messy celebrity divorce making headlines. Now imagine if that same scandal could determine whether France or England claimed a crown, or whether a holy war would rage across continents. That's the scale we're dealing with here. These trials weren't quiet legal formalities. They were spectacles of manipulation, forged documents, and whispered betrayals in candlelit chambers. Nobles didn't just bring lawyers to these proceedings. They brought armies of influence, bending laws and even faith itself to serve their ambitions. And at the center of it all, the chilling truth that bloodlines mattered more than vows and legacy trumped love every time. But why does this ancient history still resonate? Because the shadows of these battles stretch into our modern world. The way power shapes relationships, the silent wars fought over inheritance, even the way politics and personal lives collide, it all has roots in these medieval showdowns. Over the next minutes, we'll walk through real cases where queens risked everything for annulments, where popes played chess with marriages, and where the word divorce could shake continents. You'll see how a single broken union could rewrite maps, and how the echoes of these struggles still shape the rules of power today. So settle in, this isn't just history. It's the hidden blueprint of how the world works. To understand why medieval divorce trials became such high-stakes dramas, we need to step inside the medieval mind where marriage was less a romantic union and more like a corporate merger of lands, titles, and armies. Imagine two noble families drawing up a contract where the fine print included clauses about troop deployments, castle ownership, and future heirs who'd one day inherit entire kingdoms. A wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a geopolitical strategy session disguised with feasts and rings. The church's involvement added another layer of complexity. By the 1200s, marriage was officially one of the 7 sacraments, making it a sacred bond that only the Pope could dissolve. But here's the catch. While the Church preached that marriage was indissoluble, medieval rulers kept finding loopholes. Annulments declaring a marriage never valid to begin with became the ultimate workaround. Kings and queens would suddenly discover they were distant cousins forbidden under church law, or claim one spouse had previously been promised to someone else. These weren't honest mistakes, they were carefully orchestrated escape routes from marriages that no longer served a political purpose. Take Ilina of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. Her first marriage to King Louis VII of France was a masterclass in how personal unions shaped empires. When their alliance soured partly because Ilina hadn't produced a male heir, the couple didn't just separate. They weaponized church doctrine, securing an annulment by arguing they were too closely related. Overnight, Ilina's lands reverted to her control, and when she remarried Henry II of England, the balance of power in Europe tilted violently. This wasn't just a divorce, it was a tectonic shift that set England and France on a collision course for centuries. Yet the stakes went even higher when royal bloodlines were involved. A failed marriage could mean a disputed succession, inviting civil wars or foreign invasions. That's why divorce trials often resembled spy novels with bribed witnesses, smuggled documents, and whispered alliances in the shadows. The church, caught between its spiritual ideals and the raw power of monarchs, often found itself playing referee in these clashes, sometimes bending its own rules to avoid destabilizing Christendom. What's fascinating is how these medieval conflicts echo today. Modern prenuptial agreements, they're descendants of those old marital contracts, the way political families still intermarry for influence. That's medieval logic in a tailored suit. Even the tabloid frenzy around celebrity splits has roots in these ancient spectacles, except now, instead of worrying about armies mobilizing, we gossip about stock prices dipping. Players have changed, but the game remains eerily familiar. As we peel back the layers of these divorce trials, you'll start to see the unspoken rules of power emerge, how love, law, and ambition have always been locked in a tense dance. And sometimes the most explosive battles weren't fought with swords, but with parchment and ink in a church court. The Catholic Church didn't just oversee medieval marriages, it held the only keys to unlocking them. Picture a system where the same institution that declared marriage sacred and eternal also held the power to erase it with a stroke of papal ink. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was high-stakes diplomacy. The Church's official stance was clear. Marriage was a holy sacrament, binding until death. But in the shadows of cathedral archives, a parallel truth emerged where doctrine collided with dynastic desperation. Annulments became the ultimate political bargaining chip. Proving a marriage was invalid required more than just heartbreak or betrayal. Nobles had to weaponize legal technicalities, often stretching the truth to its breaking point. Consanguinity, the claim that spouses were secretly too closely related, was the golden ticket. Genealogists would scour family trees for distant shared ancestors, sometimes fabricating connections when none existed. One notorious case involved a French count who produced a handwritten family tree, discovered in a monastery attic, conveniently proving his wife was his fourth cousin. The document was likely forged, but with enough silver changing hands, the church looked the other way. Impotence cases were even more theatrical. These trials involved humiliating public examinations where midwives, physicians, and even neighbors testified about a husband's inability to consummate the marriage. In one absurd spectacle, an Italian nobleman's servant swore under oath that they'd heard no marital noises through castle walls for years, a claim that crumbled when his wife's new pregnancy with another man proved otherwise. The real scandal wasn't the failed marriage, but how easily the system could be gamed by those with deep pockets. Behind the altar, a quiet trade flourished. Bishops and cardinals received donations from wealthy petitioners, while rural priests suddenly found their parishes gifted with fertile lands after ruling favorably in a noble's annulment case. The church's dilemma was real. Enforcing strict morality risked alienating Europe's most powerful families, yet appearing too lenient undermined its spiritual authority. Some popes, like Innocent III, tried cracking down only to face revolts from kings who threatened to withhold military support for crusades unless their marital demands were met. Perhaps no case reveals this tension more starkly than Henry VIII of England's desperate bid to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, when the Pope hesitated partly because Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor. Henry didn't just accept defeat. He tore England away from the Catholic Church entirely, creating the Church of England solely to grant himself a divorce. This wasn't just a marital spat, it was a seismic shift in religious history, proving how deeply marriage law was entangled with raw political power. Yet for all its flaws, the system had an unintended consequence. It gave noblewomen rare leverage. a wife denied annulment could appeal directly to Rome, bypassing local lords. Some, like Marguerite of Burgundy, used consanguinity claims to escape abusive marriages, while others negotiated favorable settlements by threatening to expose their husbands' forged evidence. The same courts that served powerful men occasionally became tools for the disempowered when they knew how to play the game. What's striking is how these medieval struggles mirror modern debates about who controls marriage. Today's prenups and custody battles are just secular versions of those same power plays minus the papal decrees. The Church's tightrope walk between principle and pragmatism set a template we're still following, where the line between sacred vows and strategic alliances remains dangerously thin. Ilina of Aquitaine's divorce wasn't just personal, it reshaped the map of Europe. When Louis VII of France finally secured their annulment in the year 1152, he thought he was cutting ties with a wife who'd borne him only daughters. What he didn't realize was that he was handing England the keys to Western France. Eleanor's lands, the sprawling Duchy of Aquitaine, didn't revert to the French crown. As her personal inheritance, they followed her straight into the arms of Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. Within months of the divorce, she married him, turning Henry from a regional lord into a ruler whose territories dwarfed those of the French king. This wasn't just awkward family drama. It set the stage for centuries of conflict. The English crown now held more of France than the French monarchy itself, a tension that would explode into the 100 Years' War. Louis had gambled that removing Ilina would simplify his reign. Instead, he'd created a rival empire, and here's the twist. The Church's annulment grounds consanguinity. The claim they were too closely related was likely a sham. Contemporary chroniclers whispered that the real reason was Ilina's refusal to fade into the background. She'd accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, where rumors swirled about her political meddling and alleged affairs. For a king already insecure about his power, that was unforgivable, but Ilina turned the tables brilliantly. Where Louis saw a rebellious wife to discard, she saw a political opportunity. By remarrying Henry, she ensured her legacy wouldn't vanish. Their sons, including Richard the Lionheart, would inherit not just England but her continental domains. It was a masterstroke of self-preservation in an era when divorced queens often ended up banished to nunneries. Other monarchs took notes. When Philip Augustus of France wanted to annul his marriage to Ingeborg of Denmark in the 1290s, he didn't bother with subtlety. After one night of marriage, he declared himself repulsed by her and had the union dissolved by a puppet church council. When the Pope overturned the decision, Philip simply ignored it, keeping Ingeborg imprisoned for 20 years while he remarried. The message was clear for kings: divorce wasn't about morality, it was about control. These cases reveal the brutal calculus of royal unions. A queen's primary duty was producing male heirs. Failure risked not just personal disgrace but dynastic collapse. When Henry VIII of England later sought to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon over her failure to bear a son, he was following this same medieval playbook. The stakes were always higher for women. A king could remarry and legitimize new heirs. A discarded queen, her fate often hinged on whether her family still had the military might to defend her. Yet even in this rigid system, outliers emerged. Aracal of Leon, an 11th century queen, turned her annulment into a power grab. Accusing her husband of abuse, she convinced church courts to dissolve the marriage, then ruled alone, defending her sovereignty against both ex-husband and suitors. For every queen crushed by these battles, another found cracks in the system to wield for herself. The propaganda war around these divorces was just as fierce as the legal one. Louis's court painted Ilina as immoral to justify their split. Henry VIII's lawyers claimed Catherine's previous marriage to his brother made their union cursed. Truth mattered less than narrative. In an age without social media, these trials were the original smear campaigns where winning public opinion could mean the difference between keeping your throne or losing your head. What's chilling is how these medieval power plays echo today. Modern leaders still weaponize personal lives against opponents. High-profile divorces still shake stock markets and elections. The tools have changed. No one hires genealogists to fake family trees anymore, but the game remains the same. Where love and power collide, the stakes are never just personal. Ilina of Aquitaine's divorce trial wasn't just a royal scandal, it was a chess move that redrew the boundaries of Europe. When she stood before church officials in the year 1152, the question wasn't simply whether her marriage to Louis VII was valid. It was whether France would lose half its territory overnight. At just 30 years old, Ilina wasn't just a queen, she was the heiress to Aquitaine, a region larger than the royal domain of France itself. And her failure to produce a male heir wasn't merely a personal tragedy, it was a geopolitical crisis. Louis's advisors spun the annulment as a matter of morality, whispering about Ilina's alleged affairs during the Second Crusade. But the parchment-thin consanguinity claim that they were distant cousins exposed the real calculus. With no son to inherit, Louis needed a clean break to remarry. What he underestimated was Ilina's next move. Medieval queens divorced for barrenness typically vanished into convents, their lands absorbed by their ex-husbands. But Ilina refused to fade away. Within weeks of the annulment, she secretly married Henry Plantagenet, a man 11 years her junior who would soon become Henry II of England. Overnight, the map of Europe convulsed. Aquitaine, which should have returned to French control, now flowed into Henry's growing empire. Their union created the Angevin Empire, a realm stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, a superstate that made the French kings look like minor lords by comparison. This wasn't just a remarriage, it was the ultimate power play. Ilina traded a husband who saw her as a breeding failure for one who recognized her political value, and in doing so, she turned her body from a battleground into a throne. The trial transcripts, long lost to history, likely hid more intrigue than they revealed. Church law required both parties to consent to an annulment, meaning Ilina negotiated terms. Contemporary chroniclers hint she retained rights to her lands rather than surrendering them to Louis, a radical clause for the era. Even the timing was strategic. Henry was already Duke of Normandy. Their union merged 3 territories into a single rival power bloc. By the time Louis realized his mistake, it was too late. Their sons Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland would inherit this empire, setting the stage for centuries of Anglo-French wars. What makes Ilina's case extraordinary isn't just the scale of its consequences, but how she weaponized the very system designed to erase her. While other queens accepted exile, she flipped the script, using remarriage as a diplomatic coup. When Henry later imprisoned her for supporting their son's rebellion, even captivity couldn't diminish her legacy. She outlived both husbands, saw 2 sons become kings, and died at 82, an age nearly unheard of in the Middle Ages, still reigning as Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. The darker truth lurking beneath this story is how often royal women's fertility dictated history. Ilina bore 11 children across both marriages, yet it was the absence of one son, Louis's heir, that triggered continental upheaval. Modern DNA studies suggest the barrenness blamed on queens was often male infertility, but medieval science pointed fingers at women. Ilina's survival in this brutal system reveals the unspoken rules. The smartest royal women didn't just endure the game. They learned to play it better than the men. Behind the grand politics, the human cost was staggering. Chroniclers recorded Louis weeping as he signed the annulment, not for love, but because he knew the territorial disaster it invited. Henry's later betrayal of Ilina proved no union was safe from ambition. Yet in an era when marital bonds were chains, Ilina turned hers into a weapon. Her story forces us to ask, was medieval divorce really about morality, or was it always just power in disguise? Now consider the tools nobles used when bloodline claims weren't so convenient. When real consanguinity couldn't be found, inventive genealogists learned to fabricate it, ushering in an era of forged documents and paid witnesses that would make even modern scandal sheets blush. If you thought modern divorce proceedings could get messy, medieval nobility took marital sabotage to an art form, especially when it came to consanguinity claims. The beauty of this legal tactic was its elegant simplicity. Every noble family tree had enough branches to theoretically connect anyone if you looked hard enough. And when political necessity demanded it, those connections suddenly became glaringly obvious. Take the case of King John of England, who in 1205 suddenly remembered his great-great-grandmother was a cousin of his wife Isabella's great-aunt. Never mind that this revelation conveniently surfaced right after Isabella's family lost a key alliance with France. The Church's own rules made this possible. Canon law forbade marriages between relatives up to the fourth degree, meaning sharing a great-great-grandparent was enough to invalidate a union. But here's where the system got creative. Wealthy families maintained private teams of genealogists whose real job wasn't record-keeping, but strategic fabrication. One enterprising clerk in Burgundy earned a fortune by discovering that 3 different noble couples all descended from a mythical 9th century count, a man who likely never existed. The documents looked convincing enough, complete with wax seals from long-dead bishops. Bribery greased the wheels at every level. Parish priests might suddenly recall baptizing an ancestor decades earlier, while cathedral archivists developed selective blindness when fake parchments entered their collections. In Aragon, one bishop famously approved an annulment after receiving a donation of 6 vineyards, then reversed his decision when the opposing family offered 7. The Church's intricate kinship diagrams, meant to preserve moral order, became flowcharts for legalized perjury. Yet the most audacious consanguinity play came from the Holy Roman Empire. When Emperor Frederick II wanted to ditch his wife Isabella of England in 1235, his lawyers didn't bother with subtlety. They presented a family tree showing they were third cousins through a lineage that would have required their ancestors to conceive children at age 8. The papal court let it slide because Frederick was leading a crusade at the time. Doctrine bowed to geopolitics yet again, but what happened when even creative genealogy failed? That's when nobles reached for medieval divorce's nuclear option, the impotence trial. Unlike bloodline claims, these proceedings didn't rely on dusty parchments. They demanded live demonstrations, humiliating interrogations, and bedroom secrets laid bare before church tribunals. Where consanguinity was a quiet forgery, impotence accusations were public spectacles and far more dangerous for the men involved. Because while you could bribe a clerk to invent a shared ancestor, you couldn't bribe biology. Impotence trials were the medieval equivalent of reality TV, brutally public, scandalously intimate, and rigged in favor of those with the most power. Imagine being forced to prove your marital capabilities before a panel of bishops, physicians, and giggling courtiers. For men, an accusation of impotence wasn't just embarrassing. It was existential. A nobleman who couldn't consummate his marriage lost more than his dignity. He risked his titles, lands, and legacy. That's why these trials became theatrical battles where truth mattered less than perception. Take the case of King Philip of France, whose annulment from Ingeborg of Denmark hinged on her claim that their marriage remained unconsummated. His response, pointing to his illegitimate children as evidence of his virility. Never mind that the law required proof with his wife. The court of public opinion cared more about his reputation than legal technicalities. Women faced an even crueler double standard. A wife accusing her husband of impotence had to walk a razor's edge. Too much detail about their private life risked branding her a liar or worse, a woman so undesirable she couldn't inspire passion. Too little and her case collapsed. Some turned to creative solutions like the Countess of Champagne, who smuggled a midwife into her chambers to document her untouched state, only to have her husband's allies bribe the examiner to change her testimony. The stakes were highest for queens when Margaret of Austria accused her husband, Charles the Bold, of impotence. His supporters dragged her maidservants into court, demanding they describe the state of her bedsheets under oath. The humiliation was strategic, make the process so degrading that few women would dare attempt it. Yet in this rigged system, flashes of defiance emerged. Records from the Vatican archives reveal cases where women weaponized these trials to escape brutality. In 1423, a Sicilian noblewoman named Bianca presented not just witnesses, but a signed confession from her husband's own physician, admitting he'd been paid to falsify medical records. Another in Castile bribed a priest to testify that her husband had confessed to unnatural acts in the confessional, a claim the church couldn't refute without violating sacramental secrecy. These weren't victories of justice but of cunning, proving that even the most oppressive systems had cracks to exploit. The most surreal aspect, trial by Congress, where couples were ordered to attempt consummation under supervision. In one grotesque spectacle from Milan, a duke and duchess were confined to a curtained bed while doctors listened outside for marital noises. When the duchess emerged claiming success, her husband's relatives produced a sworn statement from the chambermaid that the sheets were suspiciously clean. The church's obsession with physical proof reduced marriage to a crude biological transaction, yet ironically, it was this very reductiveness that gave some women an escape hatch. What these trials really exposed was the hypocrisy at the heart of medieval marriage law. A system that preached privacy and sacrament had no qualms about dissecting intimacy in public when power was at stake. The same church that declared marriage indissoluble would pry into bedrooms if a king demanded it. And while men could recover from impotence accusations with mistresses or military victories, women bore permanent scars to their reputations. Yet history whispers of those who turned the tables, like the French noblewoman who won her annulment by smuggling in a notary to record her husband's drunken boasts about faking his virility. In the end, these trials weren't about morality or consummation. They were about who controlled the narrative, which brings us to the ultimate divorce weapon, betrayal. Because when all else failed, nothing sealed a marriage's fate like catching a spouse in the act, especially if the scandal could be staged for maximum impact. Betrayal wasn't just a personal tragedy in medieval divorce courts, it was a carefully crafted legal weapon. When a noble needed to discard a spouse but lacked the right bloodline excuses or couldn't stomach the humiliation of impotence claims, adultery charges became the ultimate trump card. But these weren't spontaneous discoveries of passion gone wrong. They were elaborate productions staged with all the precision of a royal coronation. Take the case of a French duchess in 1348, whose alleged affair with a knight was exposed when her husband's guards conveniently burst into a locked garden pavilion, despite the knight later revealing he'd been lured there under false pretenses. The real genius of these setups was their brutal efficiency. Unlike consanguinity claims requiring forged documents or impotence trials demanding medical testimony, adultery accusations relied on something far more persuasive: public shame. Once rumors took hold, even the most baseless charges stuck like tar. Queens faced special peril here. Anne Boleyn's downfall a few centuries later followed this exact playbook. Her alleged lovers confessed under torture, while courtiers suddenly remembered seeing her in compromising positions. Never mind that the timelines didn't add up or that the men's testimonies contradicted each other. The goal wasn't justice, it was creating enough scandal to justify a predetermined outcome. Some nobles skipped subtlety entirely. The Duke of Burgundy in 1415 had his wife's suspected lover arrested on fabricated treason charges, then offered him freedom in exchange for admitting the affair. When the man refused, thumbscrews extracted the desired confession within days. Historians now believe the entire relationship was fictional, but the Duke got his annulment, while his ex-wife vanished into a convent. These were power moves disguised as moral outrage, where the law became a puppet theater for the elite. What's chilling is how these medieval tactics foreshadow modern smear campaigns. The same principles apply: manufacture enough scandal and truth becomes irrelevant. Today's tabloids don't use thumbscrews, but they achieve similar results with manipulated photos and selective leaks. The medieval twist: adultery charges didn't just destroy reputations, they could rewrite entire lines of succession. Which brings us to the most explosive consequence of these divorce trials: how they sent inheritance systems into chaos, leaving crowns dangling over the heads of unexpected heirs. Because when a marriage collapsed under scandal, the ripple effects went far beyond the couple. Suddenly, children once destined for thrones found themselves branded bastards, while distant cousins who'd never expected power saw their fortunes rise overnight. In a world where land and titles flowed through bloodlines, a single staged betrayal could reroute the course of history, proving that in the medieval Game of Thrones, love was never the real casualty. Power was. Nothing destabilized a medieval kingdom faster than a disputed inheritance, and nothing created disputes like a royal divorce. When Philip Augustus of France annulled his marriage to Ingeborg of Denmark in 1293, he didn't just end a union. He lit a fuse under his own dynasty. The Capetian monarchy, Europe's most powerful at the time, suddenly faced an existential crisis. Were Philip's two sons with his next wife even legitimate? The church had technically never approved his remarriage, leaving his heirs vulnerable to claims they were bastards. Rebellions erupted as nobles seized on the uncertainty, with entire regions refusing allegiance to a king born of a sinful bed. Philip spent decades and fortunes bribing popes to retroactively legitimize his sons, proof that in medieval Europe, divorce wasn't just a family matter. It was a time bomb under the throne. The math was brutally simple. Without clear succession, kingdoms imploded. When Henry I of England's marriage to Matilda of Scotland was annulled on dubious consanguinity grounds, her powerful Scottish relatives saw an opening. They invaded not just for pride, but for the lands Henry had seized as her dowry. What began as a marital spat spiraled into a decade of border wars, proving how quickly personal disputes could bleed into national crises. Even more volatile were cases involving heiresses. Take the Duchy of Brittany in 1341. When its duke's marriage was dissolved, his daughter's claim was challenged by a cousin who argued her parents' union had never been valid. The resulting war dragged in both England and France, with each backing different claimants to gain influence. Divorce trials didn't just rewrite family trees, they redrawn battle maps. Some conflicts smoldered for generations. The 100 Years' War, that epic clash between England and France, had roots in marital breakdowns centuries earlier. Ilina of Aquitaine's divorce from Louis VII didn't just transfer her lands to England, it created overlapping claims that successive monarchs exploited. By the time Edward III of England invoked his descent from Ilina to claim the French crown in 1337, the original divorce was ancient history. But the geopolitical fault lines it created, those were fresher than ever. What's striking is how often the losers weren't the divorced couples, but their children. Joan of Kent, a 14th-century English princess, spent her childhood fighting legal battles after her parents' annulment left her legitimacy in question. Even after she married the Black Prince, whispers followed her, a reminder that in this world, parental splits didn't just dissolve marriages, they dissolved identities. Yet amid this chaos, the Church occasionally pushed back. When papal legates refused to rubber stamp Philip Augustus's annulment, they weren't just being stubborn. They understood that every time they bent marriage law for a king, they risked triggering wars that could destabilize Christendom itself. The real power play wasn't always granting divorces, it was sometimes denying them. For every king who thought he could bully the Church into rubber stamping his divorce, there was a pope or bishop ready to remind him where true authority lay. Take Pope Innocent III, arguably the most powerful pontiff of the Middle Ages, who faced down Emperor Philip of Swabia in 1200 and ate over an annulment that would have severed Philip's ties to the powerful House of Hohenstaufen. Innocent didn't just refuse, he excommunicated Philip, froze all religious services in his territories, and essentially declared holy war on anyone supporting the emperor's claim. This wasn't just a clerical slap on the wrist, it was a calculated demonstration that when push came to shove, the papal throne could break kings. The showdown revealed a crucial tension in medieval Europe. While nobles saw marriage as a political contract, the Church viewed it as a sacred institution, and some clergy were willing to die on that hill. In England, Archbishop Thomas Becket's martyrdom over royal interference in church affairs cast a long shadow. Decades later, Canterbury's clerics still risked their necks resisting monarchs. One anonymous scribe in 1322 meticulously documented how King Edward II's lawyers had altered a family Bible to fake consanguinity ties, smuggling the evidence to Rome despite threats of imprisonment. These weren't just acts of conscience, they were power plays proving that even absolute monarchs couldn't control every lever of authority. What's fascinating is how these conflicts exposed fractures within the Church itself. While some bishops took bribes to approve dubious annulments, others used marital disputes to assert their independence. The Bishop of Liege in 1410 famously convened a synod to investigate noble forgery rings, publicly burning falsified genealogies in the town square. His reward, a midnight assassination attempt by agents of the Duke of Brabant. Yet his stand inspired similar crackdowns from Salzburg to Santiago, showing how localized resistance could snowball into reform. The personal costs were staggering. The abbot of Cluny lost his monastery after blocking King Philip the Fair's annulment. A Spanish canon lawyer named Diego was blinded for exposing fabricated evidence in a royal divorce case. These men weren't saints, many had their own political motives, but their defiance proved that medieval power wasn't monolithic. Even in an age of absolute monarchy, there were always counterweights, always pockets of resistance. Nowhere was this clearer than in the case of Margaret of Austria. When her husband, Duke Charles of Burgundy, sought an annulment in 1477, she didn't just accept her fate. She weaponized church factionalism, appealing directly to Pope Sixtus IV while secretly funding Italian cardinals who opposed the Duke's allies in Rome. Her victory wasn't just personal, it became a blueprint for how the disempowered could exploit divisions within the system. These stories force us to rethink medieval power dynamics. We imagine kings and popes as unchallenged rulers, but the divorce courts reveal something subtler, a constant tug of war where even the weakest players could sometimes yank the rope hard enough to matter. And no group proved this more dramatically than medieval women, who turned the system's contradictions into weapons when all else failed. Because while noblewomen rarely held formal power, the annulment courts gave them something unexpected: a microphone. In a world where their voices were routinely silenced, the legal process required their testimony, and some learned to use that platform with devastating effect. Take the case of a 14-year-old French countess in 1389, who stunned judges by producing letters proving her much older husband had bribed witnesses to claim she was infertile. Or the Castilian noblewoman who turned her husband's own legal strategy against him, using his forged genealogy to show they were technically related, thus voiding the marriage on consanguinity grounds he'd prepared himself. These weren't flukes. Church law, for all its patriarchal foundations, contained loopholes that clever women could exploit. Canon lawyers had decreed that both spouses must consent to an annulment, giving wives rare leverage. Some, like Ilina of Provence, used that rule to extort favorable settlements, keeping their dowries and even gaining custody of children. Others found allies among reformist clergy. When Agnes of Bohemia petitioned for divorce in 1225, she won support from Franciscan friars who saw her abusive marriage as a moral outrage. The most striking cases reveal women outmaneuvering entire systems. Joan of Navarre, accused of adultery by her husband in 1348, didn't just defend herself. She turned the trial into an exposé of court corruption, producing account books showing judges had been bribed. Her acquittal was so embarrassing to the French crown that they banned women from bringing financial records into court thereafter. What these stories share is a refusal to play by the expected rules. Where men relied on brute force and forged documents, women often won through meticulous record-keeping, public shaming, and exploiting the church's own bureaucracy against itself. Their victories were never total. Many still ended up in nunneries or exiled, but they proved that even in the darkest corners of medieval power, there were always cracks where light could get in. And sometimes, just sometimes, that light was enough to burn an entire unjust system to the ground. Agnes of Poitus' scars told a story no legal document could refute. When she stood before Bishop Gervais in the year 1074, rolling up her sleeves to reveal the marks of her husband's violence, she wasn't just pleading for freedom, she was weaponizing the church's own teachings against brutality. The bishop's shocked reaction wasn't merely personal sympathy, it was a recognition that even medieval marriage law had its limits. Agnes's victory, a rare annulment granted on grounds of cruelty, wasn't handed to her. She'd spent months quietly recruiting servants to testify, securing letters from her brother, a powerful count, and timing her petition to coincide with her husband's absence on campaign. This wasn't luck, it was strategy. Queen Blanche of Navarre took a different tack. When her marriage to King Henry of Champagne crumbled in 1289, she didn't rely on emotion. She deployed something far more potent: paperwork. Blanche's spies uncovered a forgotten marriage contract from Henry's youth, buried in a monastery archive, proof he'd technically been wed before their union. The discovery didn't just win her an annulment, it preserved her crown. As sovereign ruler of Navarre in her own right, Blanche refused to let marital collapse erase her political identity. Her triumph reveals a hard truth. For women with enough status or cunning, the system's rigidity could sometimes be turned against itself. These cases weren't common, but they mattered. The Countess of Flanders escaped her marriage by proving her husband had bribed witnesses in their consanguinity case, then used his own forged documents against him. In Aragon, a noblewoman named Elvira hired Jewish physicians whose testimony carried weight in interfaith courts to certify her husband's impotence, circumventing the usual corrupt church examiners. Each victory relied on a mix of social capital, meticulous record-keeping, and sheer nerve qualities most medieval women were taught to suppress. What's striking is how these exceptions expose the system's contradictions. The same courts that routinely dismissed women's testimony would suddenly pay attention when a wife produced notarial records or third-party witnesses. The same bishops who turned blind eyes to noblemen's indiscretions couldn't ignore physical evidence like Agnes's scars or Blanche's parchment trail. These women found pressure points in the legal machine, places where doctrine, politics, and public perception aligned just long enough to pry open an escape hatch. Their victories came at staggering costs. Agnes spent her annulment settlement funding a convent, trading one form of confinement for another. Blanche faced years of smear campaigns painting her as a manipulator. Yet their legacies lived on in whispered advice passed between noble daughters: how to demand written marriage contracts, how to keep copies of critical documents with allied monasteries, how to turn the obsession with bloodlines into a shield rather than a shackle. They proved that even in a world designed to silence them, a woman's voice could still echo through parchment and law if she learned where to aim it. But for every Agnes or Blanche who bent the system, countless others found themselves crushed by its weight. And nowhere was this more brutal than when divorce trials became tools for something far darker: the systematic erasure of entire communities under the guise of marital purity. Divorce trials became the ultimate weapon for rewriting history, not just erasing marriages, but erasing entire cultures under the pretense of holiness. Nowhere was this more ruthless than in Spain after the Reconquista, where noble families used annulments to purge their lineages of Jewish or Muslim ties. Take the case of the Marquess of Ilina in 1485, who suddenly remembered his wife's grandmother had practiced Judaism in secret. Never mind that the woman had converted decades earlier, or that the Marquess had known this when they married. Church courts, eager to prove their zeal after the fall of Granada, rubber-stamped the annulment and let him keep her staggering dowry of olive groves and silver mines. This wasn't justice, it was state-sponsored theft dressed in clerical robes, the pattern repeated across Iberia with chilling precision. A Valencian knight produced witnesses who swore his wife lit Sabbath candles. A Castilian countess found her ancestry scrutinized back 7 generations until inquisitors discovered a Moorish seamstress in her family tree. The goal was never spiritual purity, it was confiscation. Jewish and Morisco converts had poured wealth into Christian kingdoms through marriages. Now, as Spain hardened into religious absolutism, those same unions became liabilities. Annulments allowed nobles to seize assets while pretending piety, scrubbing their bloodlines clean on parchment, even as their hands clutched stolen gold. Meanwhile, in the Baltic, the Teutonic Knights perfected a different flavor of marital warfare. When Prussian or Lithuanian chieftains converted to Christianity and married German noblewomen, the knights would later invalidate those unions, claiming the husbands still harbored pagan tendencies. One brutal 1413 case saw a chieftain stripped of lands because his wife testified he'd once murmured an old prayer during a thunderstorm. The real crime: his forest sat atop amber deposits the knights coveted. These trials weaponized conversion itself, turning baptismal fonts into traps. The darkest irony: many accusers were themselves descendants of interfaith unions. King Ferdinand of Aragon, who spearheaded Spain's purity campaigns, had Jewish ancestry on his mother's side, a fact conveniently overlooked when he annulled marriages for others. The rules weren't about consistency, they were about power. By making certain bloodlines unmarriageable, elites created perpetual underclasses, people who could be legally bound to Christian partners, then discarded when politically expedient. What began in courtrooms rippled outward. When a prominent Toledo family had their Jewish-descended daughter-in-law annulled in 1512, it triggered pogroms against converso communities. In Riga, the Knights' marital rulings became excuses to seize native villages under the guise of protecting Christian women. Each verdict was a brick in the wall of European racial hierarchies, proving how easily law could be twisted to serve conquest. Yet whispers of resistance survive. A ledger from Seville's archives records a Morisco woman who, upon learning her husband sought annulment, preemptively sold all their jointly held properties to a sympathetic friar, leaving her spouse to argue over empty deeds. In Prussia, a chieftain's daughter famously forged her own genealogy to prove her German husband had Slavic ancestry, turning his tactics against him. These flashes of defiance remind us that even the most rigged systems had loopholes if you knew where to look. And that brings us to the ultimate question: who controlled the evidence? Because behind every one of these trials lay a shadow war over documents, some real, some imagined, and some so explosively dangerous they could topple thrones. The real battles weren't just fought in courtrooms, but in monasteries, scriptoriums, and palace vaults, where ink and parchment held the power to make or break empires. The most explosive battles in medieval divorce courts weren't fought with swords, but with ink and parchment. Imagine a world where a single scrap of aged paper could decide whether a queen kept her crown or a lord lost his lands. That was the power of the forged document, a weapon so potent that nobles employed entire teams of scribes, not just to record history, but to rewrite it on demand. Take the case of a 12th century Flemish count who miraculously uncovered a papal bull in a monastery crypt during his annulment trial. The parchment, dated 40 years earlier, supposedly proved his wife's ancestors were blood relatives. Never mind that the monastery's abbot was the count's cousin, or that the ink still smelled faintly of vinegar, a telltale sign of recent forgery. In the hands of a skilled scribe, even truth became negotiable. The craft of medieval forgery was astonishingly sophisticated. Master scribes studied decades-old charters to replicate the quirks of dead notaries the way a particular clerk looped his G, S, or the distinctive wax seals of bishops long buried. One team in Burgundy perfected a method of staining new parchment with tea and smoke, then rubbing it with pumice stone to mimic the wear of centuries. Their masterpiece, a fabricated betrothal contract proving a duchess had been promised to another man before her marriage, complete with wormholes artfully drilled with a hot needle. These weren't crude fakes. They were works of art designed to withstand scrutiny from all but the most expert eyes. But the real shocker, how many people had to be complicit. Creating a convincing forgery required a small army of collaborators, a scribe to pen the text, a notary to add his seal, a monk to discover it in some dusty archive. The Bishop of Mainz in 1324 uncovered a ring of document forgers that included 3 parish priests, a cathedral archivist, and the local wine merchant whose cellar served as their workshop. Their going rate for a fake genealogy, 2 years' salary for a skilled mason. This was corruption on an industrial scale, where the line between clerk and con artist blurred beyond recognition. Opponents fought back with forgeries of their own. When the Duke of Lorraine tried to annul his marriage by producing a letter from his great-grandfather, his wife's lawyers counterattacked with a diary from her ancestor describing a secret wedding that invalidated the Duke's entire bloodline. Both documents were obvious fabrications, but the court was forced to weigh which lie smelled less rank. Some families took preemptive strikes, like the Spanish noblewoman who deposited genuine copies of her marriage contract in 6 different monasteries, knowing her husband couldn't bribe them all. The fallout from these paper wars could be catastrophic. In 1489, two rival genealogies for the King of Hungary sparked a civil war when neither side would admit their documents were fake. The conflict only ended when Ottoman invaders exploited the chaos to annex half the kingdom. Even the Church wasn't immune. Pope Pius II wrote despairingly of having to authenticate parchments he knew were forged because calling out noble lies risked open rebellion. Yet for all their power, these paper weapons had one fatal weakness. They couldn't stop a determined spouse from simply walking away, because when the ink-stained battles grew too vicious, some medieval men and women chose a more radical escape, not through the courts but through the cover of night. When parchment and lawyers failed, some medieval nobles chose a far more daring escape route: flight. Duchess Matilda of Tuscany didn't wait for church courts to rule on her abusive marriage. One autumn night in 1072, she slipped through a postern gate with only a handful of loyal knights, riding hard for the fortified convent of Cunning. By sunrise, she'd claimed sanctuary, barricading herself behind walls even her husband's armies wouldn't dare breach. For 5 years, she ruled her lands from those cloisters, using the Church's own laws as a shield. Matilda's gamble worked because she understood sanctuary's unspoken rules. Attacking a convent meant defying God, and no nobleman wanted that scandal. Her husband's fury cooled only with his death, a patience that rewrote the playbook for trapped noblewomen. Others took even bolder risks. Isabella of Angoulême, Queen Consort of England, didn't just flee her marriage to King John in 1216, she staged a geopolitical revolt. After John's death, she abandoned her children's court, crossed the Channel, and reclaimed her ancestral lands in France. Then, in a move that shocked Christendom, she married her daughter's former betrothed, Hugh of Lusignan, without papal approval. The Church excommunicated her, French nobles branded her a traitor, yet Isabella thrived. Why? Because she'd calculated that physical distance weakened both legal and military retaliation. Hugh's fortress at Angoulême was a day's ride from the nearest royal army, and by the time threats arrived, she'd already fortified alliances with neighboring lords. These escapes weren't graceful retreats, they were acts of calculated rebellion. When Agnes of France fled her Hungarian husband's court in 1281, she didn't just disappear. She took the crown jewels, knowing their value could buy mercenaries. The Duke of Brittany's sister Yolande escaped a forced marriage by disguising herself as a wool merchant's wife, her identity hidden until she reached the safety of Burgundy's court. Each of these women turned geography into a weapon, exploiting the sluggishness of medieval communication and transport. A lord might dominate a courtroom, but across mountain ranges or stormy seas, his power frayed at the edges. The risks were dizzying. Flight meant forfeiting dower lands, abandoning children, and gambling that new allies wouldn't betray you. When Sibylla of Normandy fled her Flemish husband in 1139, he burned her favorite castle in retaliation, then paid pirates to intercept her ship. She survived only because a Breton countess smuggled her ashore in a fishing net. Others weren't so lucky. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis tells of a Saxon noblewoman who drowned crossing the Rhine, her gold-laden gown dragging her under. Yet even failed escapes sent a message that some would rather risk death than remain trapped. What's often overlooked is how these flights reshaped laws themselves. Matilda's sanctuary tactic became so common that by the 1300s, popes had to decree nuns couldn't harbor noblewomen without proof of abuse. Isabella's brazen remarriage forced the Church to clarify excommunication rules, lest other heiresses follow her lead. Every flight that succeeded made the next one slightly easier, chipping away at the idea that marriage was an inescapable cage. These stories force us to rethink what divorce meant in the Middle Ages. It wasn't always a legal verdict. Sometimes it was a moonlit ride, a forged travel pass, or a conspiratorial wink from a gate guard. And while the church called these women fugitives, their actions spoke a different truth, that when courts became tools of oppression, the boldest justice might lie beyond their walls. But for every noble who escaped, countless others couldn't, especially the children left behind in the wreckage of these broken unions. Because in a world where lineage was everything, divorce trials didn't just separate spouses. They turned sons and daughters into pawns in a much crueler game. Children caught in the crossfire of medieval divorce battles didn't just lose parents, they lost their very identities overnight. When King John of England annulled his sister's marriage to the Earl of Gloucester in 1214, he didn't merely separate the couple. He erased their daughters' futures with a single decree, branding them as bastards to strip their inheritance rights. The girls, once heiresses to vast estates, were suddenly non-persons in the eyes of the law, their mother whisked away to a nunnery while their father's lands reverted to the crown. This wasn't just cruelty, it was cold geopolitical calculus. By voiding the marriage, John gained control of strategic castles along the Welsh border, proving how children's fates were currency in royal power games. The courtroom tactics used to dismantle young lives were as inventive as they were brutal. In one German annulment case, a lord presented his 6-year-old son to judges, insisting the boy's mismatched eye color proved infidelity. Never mind that the child's terrified sobs drowned out the proceedings. The spectacle alone swayed public opinion. Other parents went further, like the French duke who had his teenage daughter examined by midwives to confirm she couldn't possibly be his, given her mother's alleged affairs. These weren't medical inquiries. They were theatrical humiliations designed to sever bloodlines as decisively as a sword stroke. Some children became pawns in stranger games. When Frederick II's parents' marriage was annulled on grounds of consanguinity, his enemies branded him a bastard of Apulia to undermine his claim to the Holy Roman Empire. But Frederick, a genius of political theater, flipped the script. He embraced the controversy, commissioning portraits that emphasized his resemblance to both parents while circulating prophecies that his mixed lineage destined him to unite Christendom. His triumph reveals a paradox. In an era obsessed with pure bloodlines, ambiguity could sometimes be a weapon. A child with disputed parentage might lack clear allies, but they also had no clear enemies, becoming neutral ground where rival factions could reluctantly compromise. For every Frederick who turned stigma into strength, countless others were simply erased. Monasteries became dumping grounds for inconvenient heirs, their tonsures and vows legally extinguishing any claims. Chronicles mention boys as young as 7, forced into holy orders after their parents' annulments, like the Castilian prince who vanished into a Burgos cloister when his father remarried. Girls fared worse. Many were shoved into hastily arranged marriages to minor lords, ensuring their offspring could never challenge the main succession line. The luckiest became abbesses, wielding quiet influence behind convent walls. The rest, their names survive only in dusty ledger entries noting dowry payments or funeral expenses. The psychological toll is harder to measure, but fragments remain. A 13th century psalter from Lincolnshire contains marginal sketches by a child of a broken home, crude drawings of a knight and lady torn apart by dragons with the scribbled plea, "God make them whole again." In Aragon, a teenage countess's desperate letters to the Pope beg for recognition after her father's annulment left her neither maid nor wife nor rightful heir. These weren't just personal tragedies, they were early battles in a war we're still fighting today over who gets to define family and who pays the price when adults rewrite the rules. What saved some children was the very system that sought to crush them. Canon law's insistence on marital validity created odd protections. A Venetian merchant's son, declared illegitimate after his parents' annulment, successfully sued for inheritance by proving the union had been consummated before its dissolution. In Normandy, twins separated at birth by their father's remarriage later used shared birthmarks to reclaim their titles in court. Even the bastards of kings sometimes found champions, like the French barons who rallied behind Philip Augustus's disinherited son, arguing that the sins of the father shall not curse the womb that bore him. These stories force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Medieval divorce trials weren't endings, but brutal new beginnings. Every annulment launched a second hidden trial, one where children's lives were the evidence and the verdicts echoed for generations. And as we'll see next, those verdicts didn't just shape individual destinies. They forged the legal frameworks that still govern how societies untangle or unravel the bonds of family. Legal chaos has a way of forging new rules, and nowhere was this clearer than in the fallout from medieval divorce scandals. By the early 1300s, the system was buckling under the weight of forged genealogies, bribed witnesses, and shameless power grab. Something had to give. Enter the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, where Pope Innocent III dropped a bombshell reform. No more annulments based on consanguinity beyond the fourth degree of kinship. Overnight, the favorite loophole of kings and dukes narrowed to a sliver. No longer could nobles suddenly discover they were seventh cousins with their wives. The church even mandated public genealogical records, a medieval version of fact-checking that sent forgers scrambling to burn their fake family trees. But the real innovation came from an unlikely source: mutual consent. In parts of Germany and northern Italy, noble couples began negotiating private divorce agreements ratified by local rulers. These weren't love matches dissolving, they were cold-eyed realignments of territory and titles. The catch: both sides had to swear before notaries that no coercion was involved. A clause that spawned its own cottage industry of staged ceremonies where scowling spouses gritted their teeth through forced smiles. Still, the mere existence of such deals marked a seismic shift. For the first time, elites acknowledged that sometimes even sacred vows couldn't outweigh political necessity. The paper trail became a battlefield. After one too many dukes presented suspiciously convenient parchments, notaries began embedding secret marks in their seals, tiny imperfections that functioned like medieval watermarks. Venice took it further, requiring all marital contracts to be copied into a central ledger guarded by the Doge's own clerks. Suddenly, losing a document meant something very different when identical records existed in an iron chest under armed guard. What's fascinating is who resisted these reforms, not the church but the nobility. When the King of Navarre tried imposing sworn testimony for annulments in 1342, his barons revolted, accusing him of tyranny over private sorrows. The revolt wasn't about morality, it was about control. Elites wanted flexibility to bend marital law when it suited them, not transparency that might box them in. Yet from this tug-of-war emerged principles we still live by today. The concept of certified documents, born from noblemen's forgeries, the idea that both spouses should have legal standing. A reaction to queens being steamrolled in kangaroo courts. Even modern prenuptial agreements descend from those tense medieval negotiations where land changed hands with each broken vow. The spies who lurked in the shadows of these cases knew better than anyone how high the stakes were, because while laws could change on parchment, real power often lay in the secrets whispered between castle walls and the agents paid to intercept them. Espionage wasn't just a sideshow in medieval divorce trials, it was the main event. Behind every high-profile annulment, you'd find shadowy networks of informants, their whispers tipping the scales of justice. Take the infamous case of Queen Constance of Sicily, whose chambermaids were bought off to testify they'd seen her sneaking letters to a minstrel. Never mind that those notes turned out to be song lyrics, the damage was done. Servants didn't just witness history, they scripted it, rehearsing lurid details under the watchful eyes of their true employers. The art of medieval surveillance was shockingly sophisticated. A French duke's agents once intercepted his wife's laundry lists, claiming the ink smudges were coded messages to a lover. In England, a bishop's spies bribed a scribe to swap key phrases in a marital contract before it reached the papal court. These weren't just dirty tricks, they were early experiments in narrative warfare, where perception mattered more than truth. One particularly brazen operation involved a Flemish countess who planted fake love letters in her own chapel, then discovered them during a staged search. The real masterstroke, hiring a troubadour to set the forged letters to music, ensuring the scandal spread faster than any parchment could. Decoding these schemes reveals a brutal truth: church courts weren't adjudicating facts. They were arbitrating between competing fictions. When the Holy Roman Empress was accused of adultery in 1321, her accusers presented a deciphered poem allegedly proving her guilt. Modern linguists later found it was a mistranslated recipe for lavender soap, but in the moment, the theatrics worked, because medieval verdicts turned on spectacle as much as evidence. Witnesses weren't just sworn in, they were costumed and coached, their tearful performances calibrated for maximum impact. The parallels to modern disinformation are chilling. Like today's deepfakes, medieval forgeries relied on technical plausibility: a seal pressed with a stolen ring, a wax tablet doctored to mimic a lover's handwriting. But where we have fact-checkers, they had saints' relics. One cunning lord had his fabricated genealogy verified by laying it on the tomb of Saint Denis, betting no one would dare question a document touched by holy bones. These operations weren't just about winning cases, they were about crafting realities where power could operate unchecked. Yet the most explosive battles weren't fought in courtrooms or spy dens, but in the court of public opinion. Because in an age without newspapers, rumor was the ultimate weapon, and controlling it meant controlling the world. Rumors traveled faster than royal decrees in the Middle Ages, and divorce trials were too juicy to stay confined to courtrooms. When a noble marriage crumbled, the news didn't trickle down. It flooded villages in bawdy tavern songs and pulpit sermons. Take the infamous ballad of Duke Leopold the Lipless, a mocking tune that spread across the Holy Roman Empire after his annulment. Minstrels crooned about his cold bed and warmer sword, turning legal failure into a joke that made peasants snicker behind their hands, but laughter could turn dangerous fast. In Saxony, a countess's divorce sparked riots when her ex-husband blamed his financial ruin on her, slashing taxes for nobles while squeezing serfs dry. The revolt wasn't just about money, it was about a story that escaped its tellers, morphing into a weapon for the powerless. The church played both sides of this propaganda war. Bishops preached sermons framing royal divorces as divine punishment for moral decay. Yet those same clergy often took bribes to whisper different stories in private confessionals. A stunning example comes from Burgundy, where a bishop's private diary surfaces in the archives, one page condemning a duke's annulment as sinful, the next detailing the price he'd accepted to stay silent. This duality reveals the heart of medieval PR. Controlling narratives wasn't about truth, but about who could shout the loudest or pay the most. Kings retaliated by bankrolling their own historians. When Philip the Fair of France annulled his marriage in 1314, he commissioned illuminated manuscripts depicting his ex-wife as a sorceress who'd ensnared him with potions. Never mind that the evidence was a handful of dried herbs from her garden. The images of her stirring cauldron stuck. These weren't just chronicles, they were early smear campaigns designed to shape perceptions centuries before the printing press. The environmental fallout of these battles was as real as the political chaos. Marital breakdowns didn't just dissolve unions, they reshaped landscapes. Noble estates divided by annulments often triggered deforestation, as new owners rushed to cash in on timber from contested woodlands. In Aquitaine, a single divorce case in 1372 led to the clearing of an entire oak forest, the logs sold to finance legal bribes. Vineyards withered when warring spouses neglected them for court battles, while prized hunting grounds became bargaining chips. One Lombardy duke even drained his ex-wife's fish ponds out of spite, starving local villages of a protein source. The scars on the land lasted longer than the marriages that caused them. What's haunting is how these medieval patterns persist. Today's tabloid frenzies and social media wars are just digital echoes of those ballad-singing minstrels and illuminated libels. The tools have changed, but the game remains. Whoever controls the story controls the power. And as we'll see next, that power could extend far beyond reputation into the very bones of the earth. Divorce in the Middle Ages didn't just break homes, it broke economies. When the Countess of Flanders lost her lands in an annulment ruling in 1321, the ripple effects were catastrophic. The wool towns under her control, once thriving hubs of trade, saw their markets collapse overnight as new lords imposed crushing tariffs. Weavers starved, merchant guilds disbanded, and entire families fled to rival territories, leaving ghost towns in their wake. This wasn't just a transfer of property, it was an economic earthquake where the tremors reached far beyond castle walls. Some nobles weaponized destruction on a staggering scale. In Aquitaine, a vengeful duke ordered his fields burned rather than let his ex-wife's family profit from that year's harvest. The resulting famine didn't just hurt his rivals, it left peasants eating bark and acorns, sparking riots that toppled local bailiffs. Meanwhile, along the contested border of Burgundy, monasteries watched helplessly as ancient forests were felled to build siege engines for marital squabbles. The very landscape bore scars from these battles, with century-old oaks reduced to kindling for wars that began in bedchambers, not battlefields. The environmental toll was often irreversible. Vineyards carefully tended for generations were uprooted to deny income to disgraced spouses. In Lombardy, a bitter annulment fight led to the deliberate poisoning of irrigation canals, rendering fertile valleys barren for decades. Even fish stocks weren't safe. One petty count drained every pond on his ex-wife's dower lands, not realizing the ecological chain reaction would kill off river fisheries for miles downstream. These weren't just personal vendettas, they were acts of ecological sabotage with consequences that outlasted the feuds themselves. What's chilling is how modern these crises feel. Today's corporate divorces might tank stock prices, but medieval splits could empty granaries. The divorce industry we criticize now, lawyers, mediators, asset dividers, has roots in those chaotic centuries when a broken vow could mean starvation for thousands. The real difference, our systems have papered over the brutality with paperwork, but the stakes remain just as high for those caught in the undertow. Yet amid the rubble, unexpected winners emerged. Clever towns near contested borders learned to play both sides, selling supplies to rival factions while hiding their true loyalties. One Swiss village grew rich supplying parchment for forged documents to all parties, their mills churning out aged paper for whoever paid most. Even the church profited. Monasteries near disputed lands charged exorbitant fees to safeguard treasures, knowing warring spouses would pay anything to keep assets from enemy hands. The darkest irony, some of Europe's worst ecological disasters birthed its first conservation laws. After annulment-fueled deforestation triggered landslides in the Alps, regional councils began regulating timber harvests. When overfished rivers collapsed from noble feuds, fishing seasons were codified into law. These weren't acts of enlightenment, they were desperate measures to stop the elite from burning the world down around them. Which makes what came next even more surreal, because when logic and law failed, medieval courts turned to something far more unpredictable: dreams. Because in an era where power balanced on a knife's edge, even the whispers of the divine could tip the scales. When parchment and witnesses failed, medieval divorce courts turned to something far more unpredictable: the supernatural. Imagine a courtroom where dreams carried the weight of legal evidence, where a bishop's midnight vision could unravel a marriage as decisively as a sword through parchment. In the year 1243, a French noblewoman's annulment case hinged entirely on her uncle's claim that the Virgin Mary had appeared to him, whispering that the couple shared a cursed bloodline. Never mind that the uncle stood to inherit the disputed lands, the court ruled in his favor within hours. This wasn't justice, it was theater of the divine, where miracles could be staged and omens manufactured with the right incentives. The most audacious stunts blurred the line between piety and fraud. During a Spanish queen's divorce proceedings in 1381, her supporters rigged a church crucifix to weep rose-scented oil during her testimony. The effect was immediate: judges fell to their knees, scribes crossed out earlier testimony, and the queen walked away with both her freedom and a hefty slice of her husband's vineyards. Opponents retaliated with their own spectacle. A rival faction hired an actor to play a possessed beggar, writhing on the courtroom floor while revealing the queen's alleged sins in a guttural voice. These weren't just dirty tricks, they were psychological warfare, weaponizing the era's deepest fears about divine judgment. Even skeptics played along when it suited them. A crafty Venetian lawyer once argued his client's sudden blindness was God's punishment for remaining in an invalid marriage. Never mind that the afflicted nobleman was later spotted reading love letters in a tavern. The court granted the annulment, fearing backlash if they ignored such an obvious sign. The church, caught between cynicism and credulity, often let these charades slide. After all, a weeping statue might be fake, but the tithes from grateful litigants were very real. The darkest irony: these supernatural shortcuts sometimes delivered rough justice where the legal system failed. When a peasant woman in Normandy accused her knightly husband of brutality in 1295, no court would hear her until she produced a local mystic who swore the Virgin had appeared to her in a vision holding a broken wedding ring. The symbolism was unmistakable, and the knight, terrified of divine retribution, agreed to the annulment. For every staged miracle, there were moments when the marginalized used faith as a crowbar to pry open doors the law had sealed shut. This blend of mysticism and law seems alien now, but traces linger. Modern courts still grapple with expert witnesses whose testimony bends like medieval omens, and public opinion still sways verdicts as powerfully as any weeping crucifix. The real lesson of these spectral trials isn't about superstition, it's about how power dresses itself in whatever language an era finds credible. Whether cloaked in divine visions or DNA tests, the game remains the same. Control the narrative, and you control the outcome. Which makes the next chapter even more surprising, because long before modern debates, medieval Europe had its own hidden history of same-sex unions, and their dissolution played out in shadows even darker than these theatrical courts. Hidden in the margins of medieval legal archives lie whispers of unions that defied the era's rigid norms, same-sex bonds dissolved with all the drama of a royal divorce. Take the Venetian court case from 1382, where a widow named Ilina and her companion Lucia squared off over a shared home, a chest of linens, and even a beloved dog named Borso. What makes this lawsuit extraordinary isn't just the intimate details, the way Ilina described sewing Lucia's clothes or nursing her through fever, but how the notary slipped into marital language, recording Lucia's demand for what is rightfully mine as though we were wed. The judge, baffled but pragmatic, ruled as if dividing a marital estate, granting Ilina the house but awarding Lucia the loom they'd bought together. This wasn't just a property dispute, it was a love story's legal aftermath, forced into the closest framework the law could grasp. Monasteries held even stranger echoes of these bonds. When the Benedictine monk brother Gerald petitioned to dissolve his spiritual brotherhood with Prior Henry in 1294, the language was startlingly familiar. Their once celebrated pact, a ceremony before the altar where they'd pledged to share one purse, one bed, one grave, now unraveled over stolen books and accusations of unnatural intimacy. The bishop's solution, a decree separating their living quarters and dividing their jointly copied manuscripts down the middle, literally sawing precious psalters in half to prevent further contact. These cases expose a startling truth. Medieval institutions had backdoor mechanisms to handle queer relationships, so long as everyone pretended they were about property, not passion. The legal creativity in these disputes was breathtaking. A Florentine wool merchant named Marco invoked Roman adoption laws to claim custody of his late partner's apprentices, arguing their shared household made him a father in spirit. In Cologne, two Beguine semi-monastic women used guild inheritance rules to fight over a workshop, their lawsuit peppered with phrases like "she who was my other self." What's haunting is how these records dance around the truth. Scribes would scratch out telltale endearments, replace beloved with business partner, yet leave just enough clues for us to read between the lines centuries later. These fragments force us to rethink medieval sexuality entirely. The old assumption that queer relationships were universally condemned crumbles when you see how courts actually handled them. Yes, the church thundered about sodomy, but local judges often prioritized keeping the peace over enforcing dogma. When a Breton knight and his squire split acrimoniously in 1421, their lord settled the case by awarding the squire a parcel of land for long and faithful service, a phrasing that dodged the nature of that service while acknowledging its value. Survival in these legal gray zones required brilliance. Some couples borrowed marital customs, exchanging rings through third parties to avoid scrutiny, or using kinship terms like brother as cover. Others weaponized the era's obsession with property, knowing courts would always care more about who owned the silver candlesticks than who shared the bed. The real tragedy lies in what's missing. For every case that made it into the record, countless more were erased or rewritten. A clerk in Ghent accidentally preserved a stunning detail, a marginal note about two women whose cohabitation was not to be spoken of, before scratching it out so vigorously he tore the parchment. These near silences scream louder than any verdict. They remind us that history isn't just what was recorded, but what was almost lost, which brings us to an unexpected legacy of these hidden breakups, how they fueled the era's greatest art and literature. Because when real-life love defied categorization, storytellers and painters found ways to give it shape, often through codes so bold they hid in plain sight. The legend of Tristan and Isolde didn't begin as a love story. It started as a courtroom drama. In the earliest surviving versions from the 1200s, Isolde isn't just a star-crossed lover. She's a queen fighting for survival in a judicial duel, forced to prove her innocence after her affair is exposed. The famous scene where she tricks King Mark by arranging a clandestine meeting with Tristan under a tree, that wasn't romantic flair, it was legal strategy. By swearing an oath while technically telling the truth, no man ever came between my thighs except my husband and the pilgrim who carried me over the mud. Isolde weaponized the letter of medieval law to escape punishment. This wasn't poetry, it was a masterclass in gaming the system. Artists seized on these tales not to celebrate love, but to manipulate public sentiment. Cathedral sculptors carved scenes of adulterous women being devoured by helmets, their stone screams warning viewers about the cost of broken vows. Yet in the same churches, tapestries told different stories, noblewomen like the legendary Empress Theodora kneeling before judges with confident poise, their woven expressions radiating virtue rather than shame. These weren't contradictions, they were propaganda tools, teaching viewers what to fear and who to admire based on who commissioned the art. A lord funding a chapel might demand demons dragging his ex-wife to hell, while her family paid for a nearby altarpiece showing her distributing alms to the poor. The most subversive messages hid in plain sight. A 14th century French manuscript depicts a divorce trial with a telling detail. The judge's scales aren't balancing law books, but bags of coin. The marginalia shows monkeys dressed as clerics gleefully forging documents. This wasn't just satire, it was stealth journalism, smuggled into illuminated pages by artists who'd seen too much corruption. Even religious art played both sides. While official church murals showed sinners burning, some parish painters snuck in hopeful details, a repentant woman's hand reaching toward heaven, or a divorced noblewoman being welcomed by saints. Storytellers amplified these tensions. Chaucer's wife of Bath didn't just brag about outliving 5 husbands. She quoted scripture to justify her marital merry-go-round, turning theology into a weapon against patriarchal control. The effect was explosive. Listeners who'd been taught that divorce damned souls now heard a charismatic woman reframe it as empowerment. Meanwhile, German minnesingers, medieval troubadours, sang ballads about women like Duchess Matilda, who turned annulments into political victories. These weren't fantasies, they were blueprints showing real women how to navigate a rigged system. The genius of these narratives was their duality. A tapestry could glorify a queen's courtroom triumph, while a stained glass window in the same castle showed her burning for lust. It all depended on who held the purse strings. Artists became the era's spin doctors, repackaging divorce as divine judgment or feminist rebellion based on their patrons' needs. And just as lawyers exploited legal loopholes, painters found wiggle room in biblical scenes depicting the Samaritan woman at the well, a symbol of multiple marriages with unexpected dignity, or showing Bathsheba's divorce from Uriah as David's crime rather than her shame. These stories didn't just reflect attitudes, they shaped them. When townspeople saw Isolde outsmart the system in song, or a stained glass Judith holding her annulment decree like a sword, it changed what they believed was possible. Art turned abstract laws into visceral human dramas, making the arcane rules of consanguinity and consummation feel as immediate as a lover's whisper or a judge's glare. And as the public's imagination shifted, so too did the strategies of those who turned marital breakdowns into an industry, giving rise to history's first professional divorce fixers. The shadowy corridors of medieval church courts birthed an unlikely profession, men who didn't just interpret canon law, but weaponized it. Among them, the infamous Dr. Divortii of Bologna stood supreme in the 1300s, a cleric whose nickname whispered through noble circles like a promise. For the right price, he could turn a 30-year marriage into a legal fiction with near magical precision. His secret, an encyclopedic knowledge of loopholes buried in centuries of papal decrees, and a knack for coaching clients on precisely which sins to remember in confession. Admit to a pre-existing betrothal, that might work. Recall being forced into marriage under duress, even better. The truth mattered less than the performance, a carefully choreographed dance of guilt and absolution where the steps always led to freedom. These legal mercenaries operated in gray zones between piety and profit. Some, like the canonist Humbert de Romans, saw themselves as reformers, using annulments to rescue women from violent unions. Others were outright fraudsters, like the Provençal notary caught selling aged parchment pre-inscribed with fake bloodline records. The most successful blended both, like the English sergeant of separations, who donated half his fees to build a chapel while bribing bishops with the rest. Their rise marked a turning point, when the sacred institution of marriage became just another contract to be dissected, disputed, and dismantled by specialists. The tools of their trade would feel familiar to modern lawyers if unnervingly creative. Witness coaching reached theatrical heights. One French advocate schooled a duchess to faint at the mention of her husband's secret cousinage, while her servants were drilled to spontaneously recall incriminating details. Document forgery became an art form. A Milanese specialist could replicate any bishop's seal from the past 2 centuries using molds made from wax impressions stolen during Mass. Even medical evidence got fabricated. Doctors in Avignon testified to a count's lifelong impotence after being shown a corpse they were told was his. It wasn't. What's startling is how these early divorce brokers mirrored modern legal stratagems. The Dr. Divortier's 90% success rate wasn't magic, it was case law. He kept meticulous records of past rulings, identifying which arguments swayed which judges. His clients didn't come with stories, they came with goals, and he reverse-engineered the testimony to fit. Sound familiar? It's the medieval ancestor of today's precedent-based litigation, where knowing the judge matters as much as knowing the law. But as these specialists grew bolder, so did the backlash. When the Black Death swept Europe in 1348, it didn't just kill millions, it shattered the social order that made marital chess possible. Suddenly, nobles who'd relied on intricate bloodline arguments found their witnesses dead, their genealogies erased by plague. The church, desperate to reassert control amid chaos, cracked down on annulment abuses. The very clerics who'd once profited from loopholes now denounced them, preaching that the pestilence was God's punishment for hollow vows. Yet even devastation brought unexpected freedoms. With populations decimated, heiresses once trapped in miserable marriages became suddenly valuable, their fertility now more prized than their dowries. In England, records show a spike in mutual consent separations as couples negotiated their own terms without church interference. The plague hadn't just changed death rates, it had rewritten the rules of power, proving that even the most rigid systems could bend when survival was at stake. And as Europe rebuilt, the echoes of these shifts would resonate in the most unlikely places, from peasant revolts to royal successions, where the right to leave a marriage became entangled with the very idea of freedom itself. The Black Death didn't just ravage bodies, it shattered the very foundations of medieval marriage. As plague carts piled high with corpses became a common sight, the rigid rules governing holy unions began to crumble like the abandoned manors dotting the countryside. With entire noble lineages wiped out overnight, a desperate reshuffling of alliances began. Widows who'd once been trapped in miserable marriages suddenly found themselves holding unprecedented power, their fertility now a rare commodity in a depopulated world. In Avignon, records show one countess securing an annulment within weeks of her husband's death by arguing their pre-plague union had been arranged under duress. The local bishop, his clerical staff decimated by disease, barely glanced at her dubious paperwork before stamping approval. Survival, not sacrament, had become the priority. For peasant women, the chaos offered even more radical opportunities. With parish priests dead and church registries rotting untended, countless self-divorces occurred, couples simply walking away from each other, knowing no one remained to enforce the old rules. A haunting entry in a Lincolnshire ledger from 1350 describes a village where 7 women did claim widowhood, though their husbands' graves could not be found. These weren't just lies, they were acts of reinvention in a world where traditional markers of identity had vanished. Some disappearance stories took darker turns. A French chronicle tells of a merchant's wife who staged her own death by swapping places with a plague victim in the mass graves, then resurfaced months later in a distant town with a new name and husband. The church's response veered between panic and pragmatism. Some bishops railed against the marital anarchy, threatening eternal damnation for those exploiting the crisis. Yet others quietly tolerated the chaos, recognizing that repopulating Europe required flexible solutions. In Siena, a priest famously married 12 couples in a single day, all brides visibly pregnant, their previous marital status conspicuously unexamined. This was no longer about morality, it was simple mathematics. A single generation's trauma had accomplished what centuries of reform couldn't, proving that marriage laws existed to serve society, not the other way around. What emerged from this crucible was startlingly modern. The plague years birthed early forms of no-fault separation, where couples could dissolve unions by mutual consent rather than staging elaborate legal fictions. In Ghent, municipal courts began recognizing irreparable estrangement as grounds for divorce, a concept that wouldn't resurface in mainstream law for another 600 years. Even property divisions took on an eerie contemporary feel, with one Florentine contract dividing assets 50-50 as befits equal partners, a radical notion in an era when wives were legally chattel. The most profound changes happened far from courtrooms. With so many clergy dead, laypeople began conducting their own marriage ceremonies in fields and taverns, some borrowing pagan hand-fasting rituals their grandparents might have remembered. These informal unions often proved more resilient than church-blessed ones, bound by practical need rather than doctrinal obligation. A Burgundian folk song from the time captures the shift perfectly. No priest to say the words / no parchment to be signed / just your hand in mine, love / and the graves left behind. Yet as the pestilence receded, the old powers fought to reclaim control. The trial that nearly toppled the papacy wasn't about theology or territory. It was about whether the church could force a world that had tasted freedom back into the cage of indissoluble marriage. And the weapon that sparked this showdown, a seemingly ordinary annulment request from a king who'd learned the wrong lesson from the plague years. The scandal erupted in the summer of 1349, when Pope Clement VI dissolved Countess Jean of Overgne's marriage with a speed that left even jaded courtiers gasping. The official decree cited consanguinity, the familiar catch-all excuse, but whispers raced through Avignon's marble halls. Jean's staggering donation to the papal treasury had arrived just days before the verdict, her gold conveniently greasing the wheels of divine justice. What made this case explosive wasn't the bribery itself, such transactions were routine, but the brazenness of its timing. Clement hadn't even bothered to wait for the ink on her gift receipt to dry before signing the annulment. Critics seized on the hypocrisy with relish. The same pope who thundered against noble divorces as moral abominations had just auctioned one from the throne of St. Peter. Reformist preachers like Conrad of Mecklenburg circulated biting pamphlets comparing the papal court to a marketplace where sacraments hang priced like sausages. But the real damage wasn't to Clement's reputation, it was to the Church's already fraying authority. The Avignon scandal became a rallying cry for movements demanding radical change, from the conciliarists who wanted to curb papal power to the mystics who saw the entire hierarchy as corrupt. Even the Black Death, which struck shortly after, was interpreted by some as divine retribution for this very abuse. What's often overlooked is how Jean manipulated the system right back. Far from a passive beneficiary, the Countess had spent years laying the groundwork. Her agents scoured monasteries for genealogical records that might support a bloodline claim, while her lawyers quietly lobbied cardinals with promises of Overgne's political support. The donation wasn't a desperate bribe, it was the final move in a chess game she'd been playing since her unhappy marriage began. Her triumph proved that even in a rigged system, savvy players could turn the rules to their advantage. The fallout reshaped European politics for decades. When the papacy returned to Rome, reformers pointed to the Avignon scandal as emblematic of why the Church needed cleansing. Secular rulers, meanwhile, took note. If popes could be bought, why shouldn't kings demand similar flexibility? The case became a legal precedent in the worst way, normalizing the idea that marital bonds were negotiable if the price was right. Yet beneath the cynicism lies an uncomfortable truth. Jean's annulment, for all its corruption, freed her from a violently abusive union no secular court would have touched. The same system that enabled rich nobles to game the rules also occasionally, accidentally, provided escape hatches for those with nowhere else to turn. That duality would echo through the centuries as the messy, often hypocritical machinery of divorce law kept evolving, and evolve it did. Because when we examine modern high-stakes divorces, the ghost of Avignon still lingers in prenuptial agreements as carefully constructed as any medieval genealogy, in legal teams that scoured tax records instead of monastery ledgers, and in the unspoken understanding that even today, justice often tilts toward those who can afford its price. The players have changed costumes, but the script remains eerily familiar. Medieval divorce trials might seem like relics of a distant past, but step into a modern courtroom during a high-stakes celebrity split, and the shadows of those ancient battles loom large. Take the prenuptial agreement, today's legal shield for fortunes and fame. Strip away the sleek lawyers and spreadsheet valuations, and you'll find the same obsession with bloodline protection that drove medieval nobles to draft marital contracts thicker than castle walls. A tech billionaire's clause forbidding future children from claiming shares. That's just a Silicon Valley twist on the 14th century Duke of Burgundy disinheriting his annulled wife's offspring. The tools have digitized, but the instinct remains unchanged. Control the bloodline, control the empire. Then there's the courtroom theater, when a Hollywood power brokers team uncovers texts proving infidelity. It's no different from the Count of Anjou's servants suddenly recalling his wife's midnight garden strolls with a minstrel. Both are carefully staged dramas where perception outweighs truth. Even the Catholic Church's annulment loopholes persist among the elite. Notice how a list converts like Patricia Heaton or Sylvester Stallone secured declarations their previous marriages never existed, preserving their status in good standing. The paperwork is glossier now, but the game is identical. Bend the rules without breaking the facade. Forgery, that medieval specialty, never went out of style. In 2019, A German heiress's divorce revealed her husband had doctored financial records to hide assets, a move straight out of the Venetian playbooks where nobles altered land deeds with tea-stained ink. And just like their ancestors, today's power players still weaponize bureaucracy. A Saudi princess's custody battle featured a lost marriage certificate that magically resurfaced when her ex's legal team needed leverage. Parchment might be PDFs now, but the strategy is timeless. Bury the truth in paperwork until it suits you to dig it up. What's chilling isn't just the tactics, but how little the stakes have shifted. Medieval queens feared losing their children to cloisters or political marriages. Modern mothers fight against private jets, whisking toddlers to tax-haven boarding schools. The billion-dollar art collections fought over in contemporary courts, those are the illuminated manuscripts and jeweled reliquaries of our age. Even the smear campaigns feel familiar. Tabloids today play the role of those ballad-singing minstrels, turning marital breakdowns into public spectacles where reputation is the first casualty. Yet this history isn't just a parade of human frailty. It's a mirror showing us how systems evolve or don't. The same church that once sold annulments now grapples with LGBTQ+ unions, still balancing doctrine against lived reality. Prenups, once tools of patriarchal control, can now empower stay-at-home spouses. What these echoes reveal isn't just our capacity for cunning, but our stubborn hope that love and law might someday align. So the next time you scroll past a celebrity divorce headline, look closer. Behind the glossy veneer, you'll see the ghosts of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry VIII nodding in recognition. Because whether in chainmail or designer suits, we're still fighting the same battles, just with better PR teams. Medieval divorce trials weren't just courtroom dramas. They were windows into the soul of an era where the personal and political bled together in ways that still feel eerily familiar today. Think about it. Every time a modern celebrity split makes headlines over prenups or custody battles, we're watching the same script play out, just with iPhones instead of illuminated manuscripts. These ancient battles reveal a truth that transcends time, that love and power have always been locked in a dance, and the steps haven't changed as much as we'd like to believe. Consider how the marginalized fought back then. Women like Agnes of Poitou brandishing scars as evidence, or queens like Blanche of Navarre outmaneuvering kings with buried contracts. Their strategies weren't so different from today's survivors documenting abuse or leveraging social media to reclaim their narratives. The tools evolve, but the defiance remains. Even the church's hypocrisy, preaching indissoluble unions while pocketing bribes, finds its echo in modern institutions that moralize about family values until money or influence enters the chat. What's haunting is how these trials shaped history's arc. Ilina of Aquitaine's divorce didn't just reshuffle her love life, it redrew the map of Europe, setting England and France on a collision course for centuries. Henry VIII's marital spat didn't just break hearts, it broke an entire religion away from Rome. We like to think our personal lives are separate from the sweep of history, but these stories scream otherwise. The next time you roll your eyes at a tabloid's breathless coverage of some billionaire's messy split, remember, today's gossip could be tomorrow's textbook chapter. So why does this dusty history still matter? Because it teaches us to see the systems behind the scandals, those medieval nobles gaming consanguinity laws. They're the ancestors of modern elites hiring forensic accountants to hide assets. The whispered alliances in cathedral cloisters, they're the blueprints for today's backroom lobbying. The patterns persist because human nature doesn't reinvent itself, it just updates its vocabulary. But here's the twist: for all the corruption and cruelty, these trials also birthed unexpected progress. The same courts that served the powerful occasionally became tools for the powerless. The same loopholes that helped kings discard wives also let abused women escape. Even the Black Death's chaos, which shattered marital norms, proved that when institutions fail, people find a way. That's the real lesson. Systems might bend to power, but they can also sometimes accidentally create cracks where light gets in. As you scroll through dating profiles or chuckle at reality TV divorces, remember you're part of a story that began 1,000 years ago in candlelit courtrooms. The stakes might look different, but the game's the same. And if this dive into history's messy heart made you see modern drama in a new light, hit subscribe. We've got more untold stories where this came from. Now tell us in the comments, which medieval breakup would you want to witness firsthand? Eleanor's empire-shaking split, Henry's church-shattering drama, or one of those wild impotence trials where truth was stranger than fiction. The past is waiting.